Welcome to the Outskirts Film Podcast. I am Christopher Small, and today I'm joined by my co-hosts.
Hi, I'm Öykü.
Hi, I'm Alonso Gilet.
Sexploitation queen, independent cinema icon, titan of garish interior decoration, and longtime Florida resident Doris Wishman spent more than 40 years making films that zigzag across the margins of taste, sometimes legality, and genre, following routes that she stumbled into almost by accident after a sudden widowhood pushed this Bronx-born former film distribution worker into directing her first nudist films in her mid to late 40s, and leveraged that knowledge into one of the most prolific filmographies by a woman in the sound era. She was, among other distinctions, also responsible for some of the greatest film titles of all time, notably Nude on the Moon, Dildo Heaven, Let Me Die a Woman, A Night to Dismember, Satan Was a Lady, and, of course, Bad Girls Go to Hell. As Wishman once quipped on an appearance on the Conan O'Brien show, everyone makes exploitation films. The only real difference is how willing you are to admit it. I'm not sure yet, Alonso and Öykü, if I can stretch as far as to refer to you both as Wishmaniacs. However, I do want to start by asking you both a question that has beguiled even die-hard Wishman fans over the years, and maybe that can start a discussion. And that is Doris Wishman a good filmmaker?
Say she's a great filmmaker, incredibly idiosyncratic. I don't think there's any other filmmaker like her. And even at her most barren and financially bankrupt, you can really tell a Doris Wishman film just in the way it flows, even with different technologies as later in her career. There's always this kind of tonal element, I'll say. Despite her tone varying from film to film, I think there's a very idiosyncratic element of how she deals with the topics and the kind of exploitation elements she always deals with, and also kept reinventing herself all the time, and also dealt with different technologies in creative and innovative ways. So I'll say, to me, she's a great filmmaker.
People, artists, or craft people who defy the pre-existing categories like good, bad, or even theoretical or aesthetic categories like feminist filmmaking or sexploitation films. Those are the people who are the real artists, I think, because you can't just put them in boxes. And we'll probably try, even though we want to avoid these categories, today, even during this discussion, we'll probably try to engage with our films through these lenses, but in vain. So I think that impossibility is what makes her great.
Yeah, I think I agree with you both. Maybe I would formulate it this way, is that Doris Wishman is not a good filmmaker, but she is a great filmmaker. And I think there are exceptions in her body of work, as I've discovered in the past week watching these films. There are some films that have more, let's say, conventionally good scenes and conventionally good style. But for the most part, what's really absorbing about her films is exactly the extent to which she's willing to dive into so-called badness. So mismatched edits, mismatched insert shots in some cases, really abrupt tonal changes, nonsensical dialogue scenes, etc., etc. And I think, if you do want to look at her films through an auteurist lens, I actually think in many ways there's maybe no better filmmaker, because when I see these films, almost every frame is a Doris Wishman frame. I personally don't like to look at films that way so much, but I think, even more than other great filmmakers we love, I think it's probably watching her films takes the shortest amount of time to realize that you're watching a Wishman film. And I also think that truly, just like David Lynch, she's one of those filmmakers who can have an esque attached to her name. The Wishman-esque style is very, very much a thing, I think, and also has resonances beyond these films, because although these films, I think, are UFOs in and of their own right and don't really have cousins even, I'm also curious, what was your experience of Doris Wishman before we started this little project?
In my case, I also knew her kind of this queen of exploitation, and Actually, I think the first one I saw is we'll talk about it in depth later, but like the very, not that representative An Eye to Dismember. That naturally didn't give me like a clear picture of like who Doris Wishman was as a filmmaker. But then I saw some of her other films, the better known like Bad Girls Go to Hell, Indecent Desires, Nude on the Moon, which I think, despite those three particularly showing like different strands of her career, I think gave me like a better idea of who she was. I was initially approached by like these like four very different films, which I couldn't make sense of like how they fit into the same career. So actually doing this show and seeing all the through lines that kind of like articulate her work, or disarticulate her work as well, kind of make it perhaps a more endearing experience. So I'll say I didn't have a clear picture until now that I've seen like the Deadly Weapons, for example. I think that's like, it's like the brings it all together in a way.
Like, I think she was quite elusive at the time, because I know about her films. You know of their name, you know of what they do, but not necessarily their style. So I think it was around 2022 or 21 when Criterion did a selection of films. And I think that was the moment when she kind of, who is this person kind of experience. I think it was around that time.
So maybe we can just start at the beginning. As I mentioned in the introduction, Doris Wishman, she was working as a film booker for many years in association with family, so with her cousin and with her husband. The way she tells it is that her husband died, and as a bereaved widow, she started to make films based on knowledge that she had from working as a distributor. This has been a little bit contested by people digging into that history, but that's the story. And around that time, when Doris Wishman was already quite old, she was in her mid to late 40s at this point, the United States Supreme Court ruled, thanks to a documentary called The Garden of Eden, there was nothing dirty about depicting nudity in the context of nudist camps. Of course, allowed a lot of enterprising filmmakers to start making films set in nudist camps that could be defended on those terms, but which of course would allow breasts and buttocks to be showed on camera and to be sold on those terms. That was the birth of Doris Wishman.
I think Nude on the Moon is the comparatively the most narrative of them all, or like narratively coherent. There's a storyline involving two astronauts. One of them inherits a large sum of money from his uncle that allows them to build this spacecraft to go to the moon. Like, these parts are obviously quite simplified, childish. We don't see their laboratories. Like, their laboratory is just like a chemical. You see chemical substances, nothing related to space technology. And when they go to moon, they discover these alien species colony who looks like human beings, but they have antennas and they communicate through them. And basically, the almost entire film consists of their observations on the moon, watching these alien species bathing and playing games, walking around. And obviously it looks like a Playboy or whatever, like sex magazine publicity shot throughout the whole film, which I find it interesting because there's this intemporal feeling, as if the time doesn't pass during these things are happening. But at the same time, our time on the moon is limited, so they have to go back after documenting this life. So they try to make images, like photographing them, filming them during the expedition. But I found that this intemporal feeling of just people doing nothing, this idleness, is interesting, because I think there's a connection between idleness or doing nothing, or just like time stretching in our other films as well, just people doing nothing, engaging in nothing, and which translates into this pure pleasure of showing, and not necessarily voyeurism, because I think that comes later, but just this pleasure of showing and being generous about your body, which I found quite interesting.
I mean, I didn't enjoy this film as much as I think I should have, considering what the description of it is, in terms of it's kind of like a kitsch, space age, golden age, space age, kind of like can feel with a lot of like Doris Wishman nudity. But at the same time, I think what kind of like brings it down for me is how committed. I don't know if you had the experience as well, Iku, how committed it is to kind of like provide the audience with this facade of being like a serious film, of establishing some sort of lore, some sort of like a lot of like scientific words are being thrown. I'm like, what? I mean, why isn't this just like set designs and like nude people? Like, because I feel it feels kind of like half-assed in that way, and those elements of like being like a serious film that are kind of like being put forward by the production, I think is what really like sidetracked the whole experience. Because I think while it's just like it isn't particularly like engagingly constructed as some of her other films, but it's still just like the reaction shots that are kind of funny when they see like the nude people, like the girls like playing on the moon and everything. So it feels kind of like a transition period. Like I don't know if the other nudie-cutie films are like this, but this one in particular, like the poster and everything, like how people like talk about what the content of the film is, and then the actual experience of sitting through the film. I think there's like a tension there, which I think could be fertile, but I think the film really commits to that in any way. It feels kind of like as we were talking with some of the hardcore inserts in other films, where they feel like they come from other like production. In this case, kind of to me, like the new sequences seem to be like coming from a more like playful environment, while the rest of the film is kind of like a nondescript kind of like half-ass attempt at like creating a framework to show these like nudity scenes.
Yeah, I think that probably introduces an element that we will come back to again and again, which is a lot of these films are very incoherent, and also are incoherent most obviously because of the methods of production that she employed, which I think were pretty unscrupulous at times. So she was someone who really wanted to make films, who managed to make many films. I mean, she was a female filmmaker in the 1960s. I think she was the most prolific female filmmaker of the 1960s. And she really wanted to get these films done, so was doing anything to finish them. And that would be something that would come back again and again through her whole career, often in kind of hilarious ways, like in one of her last films, Dildo Heaven, which we'll certainly talk about later. There's a scene where a character looks through a bush, and the thing that he's looking at is footage that was shot 30 years before on a completely different film stock. So yeah, I think like this, it's also interesting for the practice of Wishmanology to look at those like early films as like this first sort of really just kind of unscrupulous experiment in like quick cash grabs. And also it's kind of a joke of film history that now like us who are interested in Wishman maybe have to sit through all 8 films one after another when they were designed to basically be watched by people secretly masturbating in the cinema.
Yeah, but even then, particularly with the nudie-cuties, like I think the cutie element is even more present than the nudie one. In terms like they don't feel like this like luring like pervy films at all. It's very like almost like rainbow colored, like free flowing experience of just seeing like naked bodies, but they aren't really like sexualized in any way, which is kind of, I don't know if there's some subvertive element in there from Wishman, which I don't think is the case. But if you were going to these films with the idea of just like masturbating, I don't think they really work that well even then.
Don't talk up from their perspective, Alonso. Maybe they did.
Well, I think people could find a way.
Yeah, sorry. Perhaps, yeah. I just say like the filmmaking itself doesn't seem to be like guiding that per se.
Well, but I think that was kind of the mandate of the nudist movement. No, like in order to be a nudist film, you had to portray nudity as something kind of sacred and non-sexualized. But I think people would masturbate to anything.
Looks like little boy. We got a lot of work to do. We better get going. Notice the vapor rising from her bath. I wonder what causes it. Get a picture.
I think for Doris Wishman's career, the nudie-cuties lasted for only 3 or 4 years, at which point I think it was quite well known that the kind of cycle of nudist films has sort of run its course, and people were no longer interested in going to see, people playing volleyball topless on a beach. There was this kind of, I think, particularly New York genre of the roughie, the cheap independent roughie, which I became familiar with from the films of Michael Findlay, Roberta Findlay's husband, which I think are particularly disgraceful and immoral roughies. And in comparison to those, I think Wishman's are pretty relatively tame, although they do have their horrors in them. And I think, we can start by discussing it. I mean, the most famous film from this period, and also my favorite Wishman, I think Alonso's favorite Wishman, is Bad Girls Go to Hell, which I think still remains this kind of crystallization of not only her body of work in some way, but also that moment, like this particular weird cycle of, cheap, nasty, exploitative sex films made in a kind of 5-year window in the mid 1960s.
My first experience with Wishman wasn't necessarily like finding a way to approach her work in like a representative veneer for her whole career. So this film really stood out, particularly because of that, like a rougher element, proto-punk aesthetic in a way. To think about this film particularly, like how they deal with sexuality in comparison to the rest of her career is very interesting. Again, because in this film, at least, but it's like very like an abject subject in the film. Like every like sexual experience is framed within like the most like horrible situation, and it keeps happening to the same character. The psychology of the character is something that is very palpable in the film. So to me, this film feels like a horror film, perhaps not necessarily like in form itself, but just like in the structure and the bad vibes overall. And that like level of bad vibes, as Chris was mentioning with the Michael Finley films, is something that I don't take for granted. Particularly again when this element of subversion as well, when you think about like titles such as Bad Girls Go to Hell, and then the experience of being like the same level of detachment towards like the sexual activity in the film, and how it's framed almost like as abrasive towards the audience, is something that really stuck with me like throughout the years, and just as recently as I saw it again.
Yeah, the psychosexual element is quite potent in this film, and especially really condensed in some sequences, but also paradoxically accompanied by these very, as I said, idle and eventless long sequences. So as you said, like this is such a 75 minutes of film, and you have this very different and this like discrepancy inducing experiences. Like at some point, I think in the sequences where we see our main character just like undressing in her panties, like dancing, I feel like, am I watching Chantal Akerman film? It's just such this very tedious experience of the daily life, because nothing happens at those moments. It's just like this very uninteresting way of performing, because it was also accompanied by this very emotionally or psychologically dense moments that are quite short but equally effective in terms of storytelling. Because I mean, we said, oh yeah, she's incoherent, but I think this clash of emotional tones create a really fascinating experience for us.
Yeah, it gets to an interesting idea, I think, that in a way, like this, yeah, I almost want to retire the word incoherence having said it, but like this like madness of her films, that you can never quite totally place what it is that she's going for. In a way, like that trash quality allows her to access things within this subject matter that a much more tasteful film would never manage to get near. I was thinking of in Bad Girls Go to Hell, towards the end, Gigi Darlene, which is like one of the great names from all these films, like in a filmography of amazing names. After she's gone through this like amazing cycle of like rape and abuse and just like horrible things happening to her, and she wakes up, it was all a dream, as this common Wishman cheap device. She just immediately starts becoming a housewife again and like tidying the house, and there's like and right after she's done tidying, she goes into the other room and she's in this like see-through slip, and she pulls on her underwear and kind of sticks her ass in the camera, and the camera kind of gets close with a wide angle, and it's like, after all we've seen, are you really gonna go for like the exploitative angle, like shot of her ass? Like no filmmaker with like good sense or like a sense of narrative rhythm would do that. But in Wishman, like she's going for both, like she's going for every angle that you can possibly go for. She's going for the angle of like this woman's life being just horrible and this like repetition of abuse. She's going for some kind of like, as you said, Jean Dielman like household chores, and then she's going for like an exploitative shot of this woman's ass as she's putting on her underwear. It's all in the same breath in Wishman, and I think like that's what makes her like a very, very strange filmmaker, you know? Like she's like a filmmaker. A lot of people say that like when they first see her films, it's like seeing an alien trying to make a film who has like no understanding of film grammar, no understanding of human emotion. And yet, and I do think that's true on some level, and yet like she's able to access things, particularly in this film, but also in other films, through that, like almost like a kind of a passport to that other area that other people can't get to. And also, I think I was watching it again today, and I was just amazed by the cinematography in this film by C. Davis Smith, who shot a lot of Doris's films, and like, you know, some better shot than others, I would say. But this one, I don't know what was going on during the shoot, but oh my God, it's so beautiful. Like just, you know, repeatedly going for these kind of like super kind of dense kinds of images. Like there's the scene where she's being attacked, and there's this, she's reaching her hand and she's touching these beads, and the beads are making this kind of pattern across her face in shadow. Or when she does a handstand on this armchair, and the camera does like an angle to catch her entire body as she's standing upside down, and it's like, it's such a film. It's an image book, as Godard would have said, you know.
Yeah, there are some evocative images, like the when she moves in with the other woman. I don't remember her name, but when they're on the laying on bed, we have this detailed shot of their feet. Like that image is also like quite evocative, and like there are some interesting details that you wouldn't have in other films of her, I think.
Yeah, and there's also like this sense of space, which again, like in other films might seem almost like accidental, or people frame it as again like being incompetence. But in this film, again, I think they really give like a sense of like geography, particularly to this like claustrophobic element of all these like horrible New York apartments. Like Chris was saying, like cutting to these like random objects on the room, not nearly as reaction shots, but I took it again like setting kind of like a spatial element to the films, which I perhaps kind of get diluted over time. And again, like I don't take for granted like the sense of malaise that this film kind of like manages to put forward. This ass shot at the end that Chris was mentioning, I think is particularly like abrasive in the sense that it comes after what you've seen. Like you've basically seen like the most horrible acts of like sexual violence like constantly committed to the film, and the film still wants you to like feel self-flagellation for like being aroused. It's like trying to make you aroused after all you've experienced. It's kind of like I think a very commendable thing, because it basically puts this inner conflict with the audience itself, and I think that's perhaps like the best embodiment of what this kind of film was kind of able to achieve.
You know that I love you. Why are you leaving? I love you too. That's why I must go.
If you want to see a film that dares to tell all, that is truly a body and soul shocker, then you must see Bad Girls Go to Hell.
Indecent is kind of like a transitional film, and it kind of makes sense when you look at it, because it does have like the aesthetics and the vibe of like a Roffy. In sense, it's kind of like a noirish kind of like narrative about a guy that finds a doll in a trash can and then like projects his fantasies on real people. But again, it kind of like seems to be like engaging the kind of like sex-fueled premise that will like guide like the rest of her like career in the 70s, perhaps. Like it feels more like openly and like celebratory in the way it addresses sexuality, which I think kind of like seems to be like kind of like a, I don't know if like specifically this film is like the turning stone in that sense, but like in comparison to Bad Girls Gone to Hell only 2 years prior or 3 years prior, this film does feel like a kind of engages with sexuality in a way that's perhaps more free-loving, despite having the the forms and the mannerisms of like a more like a roughie in that sense. But yeah, it's kind of an interesting film tonally because feels sometimes I was thinking like from what I recall it's kind of like a Jacques Tourneur film and others it's kind of like a fully like a 70s exploitation film. So by itself perhaps it isn't that interesting, but like looking at it back in the context of her filmography, I think that's where it really shines.
And do you consider it the elements of like psychosexual elements less present than Bad Girls Go to Hell?
No, there's also that element is perhaps the more the main comparison I can think with Bad Girls Gone to Hell. It also seems kind of like a De Palma kind of like premise in the sense like again its frame as well as it's a kind of unhinged and delirious kind of like narrative premise that eventually becomes this like conflict between like the it and the mind and like the body and how like a unfiltered desire kind of manifests. So in that way I can see that through line that you're kind of suggesting.
I saw Love Toy. I didn't see Indecent Desires, but Love Toy, when you read the summary, it feels like this is gonna be like juicy or like very interesting because it's about this man who because of his debts decide to trade her daughter with the man who's indebted to for one night, and he just like he engages with her devious sexual activities bordering on BDSM and even like BDSM or sadomasochistic sexual fantasies involving milk drinking from the floor, like acting that as if she's her kitty, her daughter, then inviting her father to have intercourse with them. Like all of these happen in the film, but she is using such a funny and gimmicky approach to these acts that you don't feel any transgressive aspect to that at all. Like even while she drinks milk from the floor in a small plate, you're like, this doesn't really like challenge me as a viewer, because like it should have been challenging to watch these like transgressive sexual acts, but I think the tone of the film is quite different than the roughness of Bad Girls Go to Hell. So my hypothesis was that I wonder if Bad Girls Go to Hell was the top of the psychosexual roughies, and then the ones that she shot later were less impactful in those terms.
No, that's very interesting because I was just thinking about that element of like submission, because again in Decent Desires you can really argue that what's happening is not really like consensual sex, because like the doll he finds basically works like a voodoo doll, so he's like imposing his own like will and desire on this woman. So yeah, it feels it's that thing that we were talking about with Bad Girls Go to Hell. Like despite these scenes like of steamy sex being particularly in this like rough like framed like very like expressively, you have this like ick while you're watching it of like what it represents within the universe of the film and within the narrative that always makes you kind of like double check yourself, like, am I supposed to be aroused by this, or what is exactly going on?
By the way, Love Toy also uses the same premise of, it was all just a dream, and then it happens again.
Which is like, the cheapest of narrative devices that like any other filmmaker would just steer clear from, but for her it was like, always an option.
I mean, in a way it fits perfectly, I think.
Yeah, I also think, like, going off from what you said, I haven't seen all of those roughies, but what I see at that time is that, particularly in the late 60s, I don't know whether it was from sort of increasing desperation to sell the films or the fact that she had made so many films by that point, but she started to be drawn to these very kind of salacious subject matters. So in, Bad Girls Go to Hell, Another Day, Another Man, which is one I saw, which is about a woman whose husband is afflicted by a mysterious illness and decides to prostitute herself to get money. Those movies have like very simple premises, where it's basically a kind of excuse for some kind of lurid debasement. But by the late 60s, I think she had turned to these kind of like eye-catching subject matter also as a way to sell the film. I mean, I don't think we saw it, any of us saw it, but there's also The Amazing Transplant, which is like film famous. The titular transplant is a penis transplant. It turns out to be an evil penis that leads the protagonist to, I think, to rape a bunch of people or somehow, abuse some people. Started the 1970s, not only with Love Toy, but another film with Sammy Petrillo, who's a famous Jerry Lewis impersonator who had fallen on really bad times. And apparently this was kind of Wishman's idea of a comedy, which is called Keyholes of a Peeping. This time she also did, I think, one of the most kind of shameless acts in filmmaking history, which is that she was on a holiday with her husband in Greece, and she somehow met this guy who was making sex films in Greece. She bought the films from him, brought them back to the United States, and supposedly was in a taxi and lost the dialogue sheet for the film in Greek. So just redubbed, a la like Woody Allen style, just redubbed the dialogue and recut the film somehow and released them that way. So, at this point, I think there's also, for me also, what's interesting to watch films like Roughies from this period is that you just see like this absolute industrial form of filmmaking, like just making things at any cost, well, not at any cost, actually, at very low cost, but just making things, with whatever resources you can, shooting in a few days, just churning it out, trying to find, subject matter or a poster that will get people to watch the film, and then your job is over. And it's fascinating to see how, during the 1960s, her career was in two halves, both of which were these kind of like lowest of the low genre films that she was just churning out very kind of opportunistically. And that somehow she produced one of the greatest films of all time, Bad Girls Go to Hell, is like an unbelievable fluke of film history.
I love like reading people's names in credits. Like it's just a stupid pleasure. And then I saw this person's name just repeating over and over, Don Whitman. And I'm like, who is this person? Like it seems to be like a frequent collaborator. And then it turns out to be it's just like a fake name she invented, and that there are several of them.
Yeah, I made a note of a name from one of the 70s pornos, Bill Yogurt. Which, I suppose in hardcore films, I guess people were even more eager to cover up their real names. But Bill Yogurt is a pretty flimsy one.
Well, perhaps talking about like flimsy names.
Nice.
Are we ready to talk about the iconic Chesty Morgan?
Yes. AKA, what was her real name?
What do you mean that's not her real name?
Yeah. This is the death of Alonso's innocence. She was christened Chesty, and then just fate allowed her to have a 73-inch bosom. Chesty Morgan, real name was Ilana Weitz, aka Liliana Wilskowska. Yes, when she was in the United States and working with Doris Wishman, she was known as Chesty Morgan.
As you might get from just seeing one of the posters or any of the posters, her chest was quite voluptuous, if you will. Which is kind of like the whole gimmick of her character in these films, because again, like Deadly Weapons and Double Agent, they are quite literally referring to her chest once again. Because I think I first saw the Double Agent 73, which again the 73 is in reference to the measures of her bosom once again. So you can see that
how many nouns can we come up with? I wonder.
They were doing quite well, wasn't it? Around 5, I think. By now.
Yeah. I mentioned earlier, but like Doris apparently was also shy of saying tits or boobs, so she would only ever say bosom, apparently. So to say she was endowed with a large bosom. I have to admit that I knew that was the premise of these films, but when the films came on, I thought that's a big fair press.
That's big.
They weren't lying. She also, just in an interesting aside before we go on, has a very weird filmography, 3-film filmography as far as I know, which is Deadly Weapons, Double Agent 73, and oddly Fellini's Casanova.
How would Fellini miss her? Come on,
yeah, I mean, I can totally see it.
The greatest tit lover.
I want to mention that in both films, in Deadly Weapons and Double Agent, besides being clearly a showcase just for Chesty Morgan's attributes, I think they're very inventive in how they incorporate it within the plot, which I wasn't really expecting. Particularly in Double Agent, there's the whole concept premise of just having her like some kind of surgical implant of a camera, and then committing to the camera flash effect throughout the whole film. To me, I was like, wow, yeah, it's galaxy brain stuff going on here.
It definitely works as a narrative plot device. Definitely better than A Nude on the Moon. And even on a really plastic, figurative level, it's interesting idea. It's an interesting idea. She's kind of like a superhero in the film. Come on. I really liked the Double Agent 73. I haven't seen Deadly Weapons, but I enjoyed it as watching a spy film. I don't care what other people say. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I think that in that one, I guess the tone feels too much like a spoof to me. So I kind of want her to take this material more seriously. Because I think Deadly Weapons, she actually does that. It does feel kind of like this kind of pulp mob film in a way. It really feels like Chesty Morgan is kind of inhabiting this kind of milieu of filmmaking. Whereas in Double Agent, it feels kind of like a Bond spoof, which again, it's still fun, but it kind of that level of ironic detachment kind of sours it a little bit for me.
Deadly Weapons. I mean, I think as I understood it, basically this collaboration, it came about when she was making Keyholes of a Peeping, and she was obviously collaborating with Sammy Petrillo, and Sammy Petrillo said, Doris, I was at the strip club the other night and I saw this woman with huge knockers. And Doris was like, And so she started to investigate, and somehow she thought, this could be interesting. So she invited Chesty, who at that time was a stripper and a burlesque dancer, and kind of made these films really at the perfect moment, because I think at that time Doris Wishman's style of filmmaking in the 60s had sort of faded, and she was kind of the wheels were turning in the muck, and Chesty Morgan became really, really famous both from these films and from her act in general. So I think it was those were the films that really made a lot of money for Doris Wishman. But I mean, Deadly Weapons, it's after I think the whole 1960s is in black and white. So to suddenly, at least the films that I saw, so suddenly to go to Deadly Weapons, which is just this eye-blasting color of horrendous wallpaper, ugly shag carpets, horrible outfits, and and also that film it has this sort of tossed off quality, no pun intended. It's kind of feels like it was put together in a day. A lot of indifferent shots stitched together, and it's just kind of built around the fact that Chesty Morgan is in it, and she's such a magnetic presence in her own way. And it's true that it is kind of missing that irony that you describe. I mean, there is even a moment late in the film where she's weeping at the death of her mobster boyfriend, and her tears are rolling off her cheeks and onto her tits. But it's Wishman is not really being ironic there, I think. There is some irony in there, but I think it's mixed with a real sincerity, because that moment is basically played as melodrama. But you're watching this woman cry on her two giant breasts in this ugly Florida apartment about a mobster husband that you don't really care about. But it's this moment of pure melodrama for me. I don't know. Deadly Weapons is a very interesting film.
It also when you think of how her breasts cover the whole frame, I think visually it's such a disorienting experience, because you usually have the beauty aesthetically pleasing bosom should be like centered in a certain way to like create aesthetic pleasure, right? To see them, to like contemplate them. But when they cover the whole frame, it becomes like something amorphous, like a dark matter. I'm just yapping here, but like I personally visually think that it's borders on experimentation, even though I don't think that's her intention to do that. While watching, I think for me it was really, wow, what's happening within the frame here? Those scenes were quite interesting.
Yeah, I think it kind of, in a way, it goes back to what we were saying about Bad Girls Go to Hell, in the sense that it's like she's able to access something with this film by being so trash that like a more tasteful filmmaker would never be able to get to, you know. If I was feeling more pretentious, I would call it like cinema of the body or something. But like, you know, you are watching a body, and you can never escape that fact. And it's almost like her, like the kind of both like beautiful and grotesque quality of her body is like, it never allows you to just like to be absorbed by it as a film, you know. Like every act that she does, like whether it's even just sobbing at her mobster boyfriend, like will always be framed through the fact that she's this like completely unique body, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, and then again, like the whole film, the film universe as we experience it is also very aware of that. Just like the sound effects, like the boing sound effects and the roaring sound effects were when her tits like hit someone, and then like the which again, well, and then in Double Legend, like the whole like use of the camera sound effect when she just like moves around. This kind of like sonic quality to these films, it makes them feel almost like a Looney Tunes cartoon. Versatility, I think, isn't really talked about that often, I think, in terms of like managing to adapt to the material. In this case, like just like, well, I need to like bank on Chesty Morgan as a figure, and understanding that perhaps she would work best in this kind of like films which aren't really spoofs, at least, well, Deadly Weapons isn't really, and but still kind of like play up some like genre elements and still have some sort of like signifiers identifiable, and isn't full. I mean, it's clearly like some sort of exploitation film, but aren't only there. Like she makes her do stuff. I mean, like all the less engaged filmmakers who just like have her be naked the whole time and do like some kind of like softcore like film,
which was actually like unbelievably Roger Ebert's complaint about the film when he when he was sitting next to Doris Wishman on the couch on Conan. His criticism was that, you know, that she's not naked for the entire film, which is, I mean, I don't know how you can watch these films and make that complaint.
This is the story of Crystal, who danced her way to murder.
What's the matter? Nick, talk! That lying son of a bitch!
She avenged her lover's death with the only weapons she had, and they were deadly weapons. She was his tool to be loved and then cast aside until he met his fate by the deadly weapons.
I mean, I know that her and Chesty unfortunately fell out, because originally it was supposed to be a trilogy of sorts that they collaborated on. And the next film was what became The Immoral 3, which is the next film, which I haven't seen, which was originally supposed to be a Chesty Morgan picture. But they had some personal differences that meant that they didn't continue. In a way, also, you know, you can also think about this film, like the exploitative elements of this film, as sort of making a path towards the hardcore pornography that Doris Wishman would make in the middle of the decade. Because in a way, the function of having someone like Chesty Morgan in your film is like pornographic, because what you're kind of ogling at an act in a way, you know, like you can beat around the bush, you can make a story, you can whatever, but at the end of the day, people are there to see giant breasts, in the same way that people are there in hardcore to see people having sex. So it's like both fascinating to see her like finding ways around that, and also almost like tease up the series of hardcore films that she would make. Satan Was a Lady and Come With Me, My Love, which is the one I've seen. It's very weird watching Come With Me, My Love, because I would say she's quite a good director of hardcore pornography, such that it is. One of my other favorites from this time, as you know, friend of Outskirts, is Roberta Findlay. Roberta Findlay also has a kind of powerful sensibility as an artist, in a way. But whenever there was sex involved in Findlay's films, it was shot absolutely indifferently, unlike the rest of the film, because she was like repulsed by the fact that she had to do it. And the legend goes, like well-known legend, was that Doris would leave the room when the sex would happen in these films. But I find that very hard to believe, because this film is pretty much only sex. Come With Me, My Love. Yeah, I would say the ratio is about 92% sexual intercourse, or orgies, or blowjobs, or whatever, and then 8% story. I mean, what story there is interesting, and actually almost is kind of a prelude to A Night to Dismember, weirdly, because A Night to Dismember, which was made a few years later, which I guess we'll talk about soon, was kind of pitched as this like transition to horror that she made, something that Roberta Findlay also did. You know, like when porn sort of ran its course, sexploitation ran its course, you turn to horror because it's the next cheapest thing to make. But actually in this film, Come With Me, My Love, it is a kind of like supernatural horror film in a way, albeit, as I said, only 8% of the story is that. But it's set in a kind of haunted apartment in New York, which there's a prologue in the 1920s, hardcore prologue set in the 1920s, and thereafter this after almost every sex scene, this vengeful ghost kills the man who has been having sex with the woman. In one scene, I almost like fell out of my seat. In one scene, the ghost kills a man when the man is taking a post-coital bath. The ghost pushes the radio in and electrocutes the man in the water, and it's the very same bath that Chesty Morgan bathes in Deadly Weapons. So, which tells you where these films were being shot. I like recognized the tiles in that bathroom anyway. But when he goes in and he starts taking a bath, I was like the Leonardo DiCaprio meme, you know, like that's like the pleasure of these films, I guess, is that it's the same three apartments that are used in all of them. And I mean, like we're sort of going chronologically, but I found out that I guess the next film we're going to talk about actually was made earlier in the 1970s, but the version that we all know was released in 1977, which is Let Me Die a Woman, which, as Alonso teased but when we were off mic, is a complicated film to discuss. But I guess we can give it our best.
I mean, we can say that it's a pseudo-documentary. Like, it engages with the documentary genre about trans identity, transsexuality. But very early on, you understand that that's not the serious tone. That's not the serious tone that she's aiming for. Even though the very key elements of this educational film genre is present, a narrator who's a doctor that guides us through the experience of transsexual people, engages with a lot of illicit sex as well. Very violent scenes of horror involving, do we say mutilation? Suicide, interesting imagery, very body horror, bordering on body horror images, and a lot of politically incorrect discourse about essentialist gender binary and sexuality. I mean, it's the easiest argument to say that to take the context in consideration, but I think that's what should we do. But also we should take into account that the tone itself is very gimmicky in a way, even though at some scenes you can't like think that this is a gimmick. This is because to some extent it feels like it's taking itself seriously. So it's difficult to realize, no, it's actually making fun of these educational films that people used to watch to jerk off.
I wouldn't say it's like making fun of those, but I think it's clearly like dialoguing and like playing along with the sensationalist aspect that was basically her whole career. just the fact that the film is called like Let Me Die a Woman, and like how it's kind of positioned in, I find it even more like kind of like sensationalist journalism than per se like documentary itself. Again, like just like this, again going back to the sound effects that it uses like very jarring, because again it's like shows like this trans woman, and then like when her genitals are like disclosed, immediately it's like crash zoom close up and like a horror sound effect, and it's like, okay, yeah, this kind of like a visual representation naturally ages pretty badly. How it treats also like a mental health is like in very low taste, reenacting like suicides and all those kind of things as a cultural artifact. It has that kind of morbid curiosity, I'll say. Knowing it's kind of like a problematic object, but having these moments of like Doris Wishman just going for it, and like playing with the most like frowned upon ways of framing things. I think it makes it kind of like, I wouldn't say endearing, because that kind of implies perhaps a more positive reaction, but it has a place, I think.
I mean, obviously I would love to read a trans writer grappling with this film, because I think it's very much it's a fascinating film. Like, to call it problematic is like kind of a understatement of the century, because I think almost every scene has something wildly offensive in it. And also, I mean, it's quite obviously exploitative in the way that you're discussing. Like, it's leering, it's cheap. I agree with you. At the same time, it's this like incredible artifact, also like an artifact of faces and bodies in a weird way, you know. Like, it's, I wouldn't want to say that anyone should kind of push away the like horrible things that are said in this film or shown, but I mean, you know, the movie is this like really beautiful document of like trans faces, like this group of trans people in a room with like a doctor is kind of lecturing them about their lives. Nonetheless, like, you do get to see them speak a little bit about their lives. You know, what I know about the production of this film was that in the early 1970s, a connection. This is all thanks to Michael Bowen, so I really do want to shout him out for this like amazing research that he's done on Wishman's career. But start of the 70s, actually a woman who used to run a nudist camp, who helped Doris shoot at her nudist camp in those early films, at that point became this kind of like director of this institute that was established to help so-called transsexual people, and basically, as seemed to happen a lot of this time, she called Doris up and said, hey, this maybe would be an interesting subject for a film. And they had raised some money and they wanted to make something, so it came about as a product of that. And I think this first version of the film, which didn't have the same title, and is completely unavailable now, apparently was like much more of a kind of stage documentary with these kind of like salacious elements. So it was much more kind of consciously exploitative. But Wishman like fell in with this community. She liked these people because, like her, they were all kind of outsiders and like cast aside by society, and they also didn't have any money. And so in a way, I think she saw a parallel with herself. Like, you know, they were scraping together all the money they could to get a sex change operation, and she was scraping money together to make these films. So she became friends with people, and I think that's where this main interview with Leslie that makes up the bulk of the film, I think that was made in the second iteration of the film. And that creates also an interesting tension within the film, because yeah, you see these like scripted, weird, sort of hectoring, didactical scenes, which of course like are so flimsy that nobody can buy them as that. And then that's mixed with this interview where you see this woman who also herself has many problematic opinions, identifies as a transgender homophobe, which is interesting, but she's allowed to speak. And like when she speaks, like she says crazy stuff, but like it's her speaking. So there's that tension in the film that I guess was only the product of this like revised version, you know. So you just like from one minute to the other in this film, you're swinging between something totally exploitative and then totally human. Like also, you know, famously you see a sex change operation, you see medical footage of a sex change operation, which is itself an amazing document, you know, like as well as this kind of leering, exploitative side.
In that sense, that dichotomy between like the like exploitative and like luring nature and the kind of like underlying humanity kind of made me think as well as another like dated and much discussed like document of like trans cinema, perhaps, so trans adjacent cinema, which is like Ed Wood's Glenn or Glenda, but just like the fact that it exists as some sort of like historical document and it kind of like offers some kind of like perspective for how outdated it is kind of, and also coming from a figure as Ed Wood in this case of Doris Wishman, kind of makes them beyond just like the kind of like PSA or like informational like films. Like there's some kind of like artistic dialogue and attempt in there, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not. I think among the films I've seen, I think that this is one of the least favorite ones for me. But like when you think of these shots where she's in the she goes to medical examination, one of the subjects, and in the beginning you see her face and they talk with the doctor, and at some point there's this extensive sequence where he points out how the reconstructed vagina functions, and it's a quite long part, like anatomic. He explains how the arousal works, like how it's quite detailed, and then I realized that I forgot that that's actually belongs to a human body, because it's objectified in such a way that you forget that a human being opened their legs and that's them actually, but you think that it's just like a model, and maybe that was what really destabilized me, while that sequence was quite like a shock after it ended. But at the same time, you have another sequence where Leslie mentions that she thought, like when people asked about how it felt like being a man or whatever, she says like, no, I was actually a woman and people were thinking I was a man. So it was like a liberating thing. I never understand how people could interpret it in such a way, because for her, it was such a crystal clear that she was actually a woman. So for her, becoming herself was what was supposed to happen. The early version of herself was false, like erroneous, and that is quite actually that is a good way of like positive way of thinking of the trans experience. So you have these like glimpses of yeah, she's right, and then you have that vagina scene. So it's quite like in the whole different extremes of questions, which makes this film very hard to like appreciate or hate. You're just like an object, as you said, like a cultural artifact, maybe.
I am lonely, yet I feel wonderful because I'm a woman now. Last year, I was a man.
The next film comes completely out of nowhere, which is A Night to Dismember. I mean, what did you think of this movie?
Yeah, I think I mentioned this was my first Doris Wishman.
Wow.
Naturally, I didn't know what I was getting into. And actually, to this day, my experience with it is kind of like trying to see it kind of detached from Doris Wishman in a way, which is kind of like deconstructed slasher, almost kind of like a cubist experiment in how to like frame together, kind of create kind of like a collage of like the slasher experience. And in that sense, I think it's kind of like amusing to me still in how it takes like the basic elements of recognizable iconography of what like a horror movie is in this period in time, and just puts them out there. And I know a lot of people like criticize it because of that, because it's like functionally it doesn't really exist as a narrative or as any semblance of like an experience in a cohesive manner. But yeah, just like as this fragmented, almost kind of like primal experience of like horror film, that's where I kind of like see value in it. I know it wasn't like attempted as any kind of like experimental, like I think some people call it a Dadaist experiment in some way. Clearly not. But by accident, I think it kind of like showcases some very elemental form of horror that kind of makes me want to think like, how would like a fully formed like Doris Wishman slasher would work? Because again, I think I agree with you that it kind of comes out of nowhere, But when you see some of the elements that the iconography she was playing with in previous films, even in Let Me Die Woman, like particularly like the suicide scenes and like the use of sound effects and like from the roughies, there's like some dialogue with like pulp elements that I think kind of makes sense for her to eventually make a horror film. And so it's kind of a shame because again, in this film, it clearly shows like she knew what composed a horror film. We just never got to see like the fully formed, like the jigsaw puzzle is kind of like all fucked up, and this is what happened in this film. It's just like almost like framing like different pieces all spread around, and yeah, you can have to imagine for yourself what that will be.
I found it insightful when I read that Doris Wishman didn't see movies because I mean she loved making movies, I think, and like that was something that really animated her, was like the joy of being on set and creating images. But like she didn't understand movies and that's both in a good way and in a bad way. And in this movie, yeah, exactly as you said, it's almost like she's ingesting the basics of a genre without like any understanding of how things go together. Compounded by like the well-known history, well, possibly false history of this film, that the lab technician vengefully burned much of the footage, and she had to like reshoot and make the film out of outtakes. Always interesting to me that in the like redone version that she did, she brought on Samantha Fox, like the well-known porn actress, who supposedly paid Doris Wishman to be in this film in order to have her like break out. Of course, I mean the film that what she got for that money was I guess not what she expected. I mean, it's kind of like this dream of a movie more than a movie, really. I found it kind of an impossible movie to watch at home because it's like non-narrative in the extreme, and it's almost like seeing like body parts in a bog or something, you know. Occasionally like an arm will come up, a leg. You can kind of make out that there's a body, but otherwise, you know, you're just seeing like a succession of images. And I think, in a way, a lot of the time when exploitation films or horror films can be a little incoherent, people can tend to compare them to experimental films. In this case, I think it's entirely justified. You know, this movie really is like Robert Beavers or or something like that, you know, because you're just like seeing really fast successive shots of like faces, hands, elbows, an axe, the edge of a room, a light, you know, like it, of course there's not really any rhythm to it. It really does feel, I mean it's a kind of a fascinating film because it's this like in a way kind of skeleton key to understanding all of Doris Wishman's films, because it's Wishman completely distilled. But also, I think, like, as an object, I just can't really find a way into it because it's, like, so unwatchable in some way.
Yeah, now that you mentioned, actually, I thought about, like, Peter Szykarski's Outer Space.
Yeah, totally.
Which is kind of like, I think it's usually called, like, some kind of, like, premonition or, like, an approximation to a horror film. And in a way, you could say, like, Doris Wishman made that, like, 15 years earlier. And because they also have this like central figure in the Szykarski film is like Barbara Hershey in this case, like some of the folks. So I know there's something to that. I think also I think the fact that it's almost accidentally experimental film even makes it more endearing to me. Than I think if like an experimental filmmaker would approach the same material, I think they would do perhaps something a little bit more less primal and effective to me. Like there'll be more double expositions and those kind of things.
There is a connection between Doris Wishman and experimental cinema. I mean, it's also true of like a lot of amateur filmmakers, but in her case, like the combination of like primitivity or like primitiveness in those films and like what is often like really bravura technique, like you can't help it. And I think this is the movie that Szykarski is a perfect, I didn't think of that, like a perfect analogy, you know, in the sense that it's like a film that, you know, ghosts are coming out of the celluloid, like ghosts of a genre film somehow.
I think back to like the Selka Show episode and how, again, like Özcan Zerla and all these filmmakers kind of like put on a pedestal, like Mojica Marin's almost kind of like force of filmmaker. I can also see that happening with Doris Wishman.
This movie will destroy the myths of all horror films. It will be an experience that will have its audience asking itself what has gone wrong in the world today. This film is called A Night to Dismember.
I hate them. I hate them. I wish they were dead.
Cellar of the grave to the attic of the haunted, A Night to Dismember will stun and startle even those with the strongest will, who have no belief in the supernatural.
Actually, in a sort of weird rhyme or echo of last week's episode on Meiko Kaji, I'm straining to make connections here. Wishman also kind of, fell out of the film industry. In her case, I think, against her wishes in the late 70s. I think A Night to Dismember was made and undone in 1979, and she, good for her, she stuck with it and saw it to some form of completion. But the experience completely destroyed her career. Like a lot of filmmakers from this time, she entered the 1980s, and most of the 1990s is a kind of, wasteland that she was struggling to find a place in. She had no money whatsoever, so she sold a lot of the rights to her previous films that she was planning, and somehow she had a sense that they would be useful again. I guess would later turn out home video, but she had a feeling that she could profit from them again, but she was forced to sell them. And she actually took up work in a Florida sex shop where she worked for more than 15 years, I believe. Which is also kind of an amazing idea that, these kind of perverts who had masturbated to her films in the past would come into this sex shop and be served by the very woman who had made those films. It's kind of an unbelievable thought. Also an unbelievable thought, I just want to say it, that, whether it's directing hardcore in 1976 or working in the sex shop, respect to this woman who was in her mid to late 60s and then in her 70s. Apparently she was under 5 foot. This old Jewish lady who was shooting on hardcore sets in a Florida sex shop. And basically she worked there until some kind of retirement, which coincided very happily with a kind of renewed interest in Doris Wishman's work, thanks to underground festivals and so on. And she quickly turned that into a way of making films. So she was famous for meeting these people who would interview her about her films, genre fans. And she would be like, oh, you can be in my next movie. You can help me with this. You can do this. And so she turned that into 3 final films. Satan Was a Lady. Apparently she reused that title because she liked the title so much and felt it was wasted on a hardcore film. Dildo Heaven, which is maybe the greatest title of all time.
Viva la dildo.
And Each Time I Kill, which was a film that she also made in 2002. She shot, and when the shooting was over, she found out that she had cancer, went to the hospital and never left. And the film took a long time to be completed because I think, what people who worked on the film said was that, they all knew that editing was where a Wishman film was made. So without her, I think it was very difficult to complete that film. But it was completed, and I think all 3 of those films basically only exist in bootlegs. Let's talk Dildo Heaven. This is one for the late style heads out there. Because this is, boy, is this a late style film. It's as pure as they come.
She's 89, and I can just imagine her carrying around the shittiest DV camera possible in the early 2000s. Just working with this random range of Floridians, which I guess nobody really made a career out of this film. I mean, to me, this film is perhaps her more visually expressive of all her work, including the films she made in the 70s.
Wow.
Because I mean, just the way she intersects the material, because there's a lot of material from her previous films that she shows here, but I was just struck by the magic of this peeping Tom character.
Oh my god, Billy.
Every time he appears, it's to segue into one of the sequences from her other films. To me, it's pure cinema when he goes to a door lock, a 2000s door lock, which doesn't necessarily have the same.
Yeah, totally not. You can look through a door lock from 2002.
He looks through it, and the shot is just a cartoon door lock, with the same frame, and then you see in one of the footage from one of her previous films. I was like, yeah. I mean, this is like when it's always worth thinking about montage. I think they were kind of like thinking of this kind of stuff. Yeah, like the narrative itself is also kind of like a throwback, I guess, like to like the kind of like nudie-cutie films in a way. But I also find them tonally more in line with like the Deadly Weapons, because I think there's like perhaps more like I wouldn't say like seriousness to it, but I guess the girl power in this film feels more like palpable to me. Because again, it's like, well, basically the plot, if people are interested in that, it's like this random group of like friends who decided all simultaneously that their main goal is to have sex with their bosses.
Which is not really explained or kind of fleshed out in any detail. It's just kind of taken at face value.
Yeah, and it happens almost like independently, because I don't really get. But the whole plot of the film is just like them trying to like seduce their bosses. And this Billy character, which to me is like the heart of the film.
Emotional core.
Because he does have like a relationship with the girls at the end, and they tease him, and they have like the whole... And Billy in this film, for like Wishmaniacs and Outskirts, is the character that has like the dream sequence. So one could argue he's the real protagonist here.
Interesting analysis.
But as you say, like, Dildo Heaven to me, even just like on a plastic level, the fact that it was like recorded and in this like, again, like awful digital like format, but still like her ways of approaching the camera are not really like geared towards that format. It isn't really exploratory in that sense, so it feels like she's kind of trying to remake kind of like the 60s styles, like kind of like free-flowing goofy comedies, just without even acknowledging the fact that it's on a different device. And to me, I don't know, it was quite magical.
I mean, it's like Sex and the City in a way, like the girl power, like the girl living in the cities, working, and also like having sex with her boss. Like that's that kind of tropes. I think it's Lisa with the curly, blonde curly hair. The scenes of her having sex with the photography guy clearly kind reminded me of her early works. I think the camera work in these sequences are quite reminiscent of her early work, but the formal experimentation, I definitely agree with you, and the cheerfulness. It is also quite a cheerful film, but you know what is interesting is also at the end they all come together, and we kind of have the account of what happened again a second time. So these kind of really goofy repetitions is also what makes film so funny, because you see the scene that you just witnessed again
like 5 minutes earlier.
Yes, but it also has this very, I mean, I call this like self-referentiality in Doris Wishman cinema that's starts like in the 60s, so she never leaves that. And even in Dildo Heaven, which is like full of these references that you mentioned through the Billy's dreamy or fantasy excursions to the Wishman land that take us back to her early works, but also the television itself. In the beginning, the girls are watching the TV, and there's Love Toy playing on the screen, and one of them says, it's just like a child, like it's just like, this is like entry level stuff kind of thing. So she mocks her own BDSM film in a really funny way. And this is like an inside joke, obviously, for people who know Wishman cinema. So I think while you watch it, knowing that what she made in the past, you also feel kind of included there. Like, I have right to be there. I have right to enjoy this film. That's probably the most feminist film that we can, like, if we're to call this feminist, that's our most feminist film.
I mean, you literally have like an ending where it's like, yeah, men are totally expendable. Like,
yeah, I mean, you kind of answered my question in a way, Oku, because you know every other Wishman film that we've talked about like had an audience. Like, audiences were like very much part of the equation of those films. Whereas when I watched Dildo Heaven, it was of course an experience that a lot of late films of auteurs that you have watching them. But you know, you're watching this and you're like, who is this for? I mean, is this for like, is this for someone like to like rent in a sex shop, or like what is this? And then, yeah, as you're right, like eventually you just have to come to the conclusion that it's like for Wishman heads, for Wishmaniacs, you know, there's no other possible audience. But also just like a pleasure of like seeing her go through the hits. Exactly, because as you said, Alonso, like it is constructed almost exactly the same as her films of the 60s, except the fact that it's not on this like beautiful black and white 16mm, but it's on this like repugnant digital video. But there's just like there's a pleasure in that, and there's also like this. There is also kind of a maddening, but also fun centerlessness to the film. Like it never, it's like a familiar frustration from Wishman films. Like it seems to be about a subject, but then it does everything it can to not be about that subject, you know? Like you could really easily characterize this as a film, like as a kind of like feminist female friendship, going around sleeping with their bosses, and at the end they decide that their dildos are better. But actually when you watch it, the film, you know, it gives you that experience on some level, but a lot of the time it's just like very diffuse. It's like people being in rooms, people walking down the streets, you know, like it's like a total sort of like stream of consciousness style of filmmaking that isn't necessarily tied to like genre cues, narrative cues, whatever. And this is just the most ultimate example of it, because you know that she was 89 years old, she was just doing whatever the fuck she wanted.
The most feminist film that ever can be is the one that defies the feminist readings, feminist categories. So I think that's what makes it feminist. Like you can't just use like the pre-existing categories or theoretical lines of feminism here, which makes it even more feminist by its own existence, by its own. So yeah,
I want to mention like some sequences where just like you see one of the girls just like randomly go on down, see some cakes being made, she's just like walking around, it was just hanging out. It's great. And also has a trombone leitmotif, which is perhaps one of the things like I didn't notice until I saw this film, which is one of the things I miss the most in cinema. It's like trombone leitmotifs. It's like
you know, maybe to conclude in some way, I mean, you know, part of the pleasure of watching someone like this is also just to discover someone who was like a business person first. You know, like it's very characteristic to me that she like got this late in life fame. She discovered that she had become a cult director, and her first impulse was just to make films, even at a very old age and for no money. You know, I really regret the absence of people like that in cinema today. You know, I mean, she clearly was an artist. I mean, like that's without a doubt. Maybe to go back to the, you know, original formulation, as I said, I think that she's not necessarily a good filmmaker all the time, but she's a great one overall. And, you know, she has like a very powerful artistic sensibility, but she's also just someone who like was willing to do basically anything to make movies. I admire that. You know, and looking at this like different stages of her career, you can just see a woman who was just like finding any way to get movies made and get them seen by whoever could see them.
Yeah, I mean, and she never clung to any idea, a preconceived notion of like what her cinema was or how it should look. Like she never conceived herself as an auteur, I think. And to me, it was also very commendable because it let her play with like a lot of, erratically, yes, but with a lot of like different expressions. Like her career had like 3 or 4 different like totally distinct forms. And then you have like these like late films again, which is just like banking on that like being recognizable and doing whatever she wanted. And to me, that also like going back to Dildo Heaven, like that film to me is such a joy because you can really tell just by seeing it like how she sees her own career in that film. And that like almost like never taking it too seriously, but also being like playful. And that playfulness to me is what characterizes like her whole oof.
My dildo's very close to me. I keep it in my drawer. It's HIV negative and has no flaw. Someday I'll find my love divine and I'll be overjoyed. But till that fateful day, my dildo fills the void.
Reach for your dildo! Reach for your dildo! Reach for your dildo!
That's it for Doris Wishman, but what have you guys been watching this past week?
I spent a bit of a time at Cinéma du Réel last week. We had a documentary film festival here in Paris, so I watched a couple of films there. the rib of the Greater Bay Area. It was by a filmmaker that I really admired. His previous film, Periphery of the Base, Zhu Tao. I hope I pronounce his name correctly. But it's just this really interesting experience of a film. Quite hard to describe because it's shot on a teleobjective. I think that's how we call it. So it starts with this tracking shot in the Bay Area, and it just goes and on to the right. But then something happens, like you have this flu or blocking on the screen, and it brings us to a completely different environment and a weather condition. The soundscape changes, and this happens throughout the whole film. So it's just this really dizzying experience of watching those images. I keep myself like concentrating. Okay, I'm gonna focus and notice when the change happens, but it's just such a fluid and interesting way of image and sound editing. It's just impossible to find a point of reference. You just like floating and flowing within the images. It's definitely one of the cinematic highlights of the year. I also saw a couple of shorts, a Sharon Lockhart film, Windward, which also I think opened in fall festivals last year. And I also catched some Jumana Mana films I haven't watched before. It was a lovely festival. I think the programming this year was quite lovely, definitely better than last year. There was Levers by Ryan Vermette, London, Ben Rivers film, some good films from Locarno. Shout out to Locarno. And it was it was good programming. And there's also a Luke Fowler retrospective, which I unfortunately couldn't find time to follow. And it's a large chunk of filmography, which I always feel like pressure to watch everything. So I end up not watching it at all. But basically, apart from Wishman universe, that's where I kind of went into last week. How about you?
Yeah, I guess in my case, the Wishman universe was kind of my safe haven because once again, foolishly, I tried to engage with contemporary film.
How many episodes will it take before you realize this is not to be?
Like I'm just like fully like around these like joyful filmmakers we talk about, and it's like, yeah, perhaps I should give like I don't want to be like that reactionary cinephile that just says everything new is wrong, is bad. Then I go and I watch like the newest Oliver Latche film, which is a filmmaker I already knew and didn't like.
Talking about Siddharth.
Yeah, I'm talking about Siddharth. Yeah, so. I saw people hated this film, and the reasons they hated this film made me just intrigued enough of perhaps I like this film. Because I thought it was very like what it's going for, and it's like some genre elements, and it's kind of like in low taste. I'm like, perhaps that's like an Alonso film. But no, because the way, to me at least, like Lasche like embraces his like lower impulses in this film is totally counterintuitive to what I seek out in like a genre film. Which is very like, detached and still clearly like playing to like some aura of respectability, like his like landscape shots, which are going all the way back to Mimosas, which he also recorded in Moroccan like Atlas Mountains. Like that element of like transcendental nature and like the natural world being this kind of like place of like enlightenment, kind of like to me permeates the whole experience of the film. And then when it gets to like the more like abrasive parts of just being almost an exploitation film. I'm totally lost because it's all permeated again like this veneer of tourism and like beautiful images, and I just feel like very like I don't know like fake how he kind of like tries to like give some thrust to his film through this like genre element. There's some exploitation elements in there that kind of make me think of like 2000s like severe and solemn like auteurs like in Cannes and these film festivals where you saw like not only Haneke but like a lot of Mexican filmmakers like Amar Escalante and like those kind of guys, which they saw violence and this kind of element of like exploitation and some form of art, like signaling towards like universalities and like some kind of like gravitas and pathos that they couldn't really achieve through normal dramatic like ways. So just throw away these like shocking moments, and to me that's kind of like what Latche does, which in theory again is something that I like in exploitation films, but when it's kind of framed in this way, to me it's just like kind of like totally counterproductive. And I also mentioned like if this film was done with by a less like respectable filmmaker, I think it'll be more interesting to me. Just having like ravers in the Moroccan desert, like all like doing drugs and then just like being killed off by their like detachment from the political context, kind of sounds like a Fulci film in some way. But then Lache has all this like pondering towards like some suggestion of a post-apocalyptic world that's never really like explained or addressed, and then the way he kind of like frames like the bodies that actually inhabit like the desert is kind of very, to me at least, felt very exoticizing as well. So I don't know, it feels like a kind of like a fraudulent film in many ways.
It's interesting to me that you often see like respectable like prestige directors wanting to be exploitation directors, and you also see exploitation directors wanting to be prestige directors. Like sometimes you'll see an exploitation director, given the right circumstance, will try to make something that they perceive as like prestige, which of course, like of those two options, I prefer the latter one. But it's interesting, like just I was just thinking about it while you were talking about Siddharth, like Wishman is like one of the only people who doesn't seem to want to make any other film other than the ones that she's making. Because at the end of her career, she just like is like, okay, what you want to make anything? Like, all the commercial trappings are gone. Like, what do you want to make? I'll make the same thing. Dildo heaven. I actually saw the like two films. I will only speak briefly. I was traveling last week, so I didn't see too much. But interestingly, about Dildo Heaven, I saw I saw Dildo Heaven in the mix with two like very inappropriate films for that film. And when I log it on Letterboxd, I'm sure it'll be very funny. One was Satan Tango. And the other one was Marketa Lazarova, the famous like Czech historical epic. And I came home from Marketa Lazarova, and I was like, well, I have to watch Dildo Heaven. so it was like one of the oddest double bills of my time as a cinephile. It was interesting seeing those two films together because there are like interesting ways to compare them. I mean, they're both obviously like massive black and white epics is like the obvious thing to say. But, Satan Tango has all these kind of like amazing mobile tracking shots through space, whereas Marketa Lazarova is like a much more sort of jagged, experimental version of the same thing. It also has scenes of like torture to do with drinking milk, which I found interesting. Also, like, thinking about this point about Siddharth, I mean, Satan Tango by this point is very much kind of a canonized film. And also this kind of slow cinema monolith that I guess is a kind of a Bible for a lot of filmmakers now. Also because Béla Tarr, late in his life engaged in what I would say kind of like the bad kind of scams, which are these like film schools in Cuba or wherever it was, which, if I'm being totally honest, like degraded my opinion of Béla Tarr. Even though a lot of my favorite filmmakers ran scams, I don't think these are ones that I approve of. But watching Satan Tango, I was like really amazed, obviously, by this like incredible film. And I was also amazed because this kind of like heritage of like so-called slow cinema that like was pilfered from Béla Tarr, never had any of the kind of like moving camera ingenuity of that film. Like that film is like a constant redesign of its own like visual map. In a way that, like, of course, slowness is part of that, like a slower pace is part of that. But the camera, even in like very confined spaces, is always moving. It's always trying to find like different angles on a person.
A drunk film, like, because people are drinking palinka all the time. And what I remember is just being dizzy and disoriented all the time watching it, like the people in it.
Yeah, also because like the physical experience of watching it is like so tiring, of course. So you're also in this kind of like semi-drunk state watching it. But yeah, it's true that there's this like, tango-like movements of the camera and so on. But yeah, that's what I've been watching.
Thanks for listening. You can send those letters with your comments, be it like positive or negative about the show, at outskirtsfilmmagazine@gmail.com. Next week on the show, we'll be talking about El Enmascarado de Plata, the legend from Arena, Mexico, the mystic man from Doctores, Santo himself, as he battles vampires and mobsters and evil brains and all sorts of like evil foes.
Don't forget to subscribe.